Dr. Goyal is the director of the Medical Humanities major at the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society at Columbia. He received his Bachelor's of Arts from Dartmouth in 1997, MD from Columbia in 2001, MA from Columbia in 2002, and the PhD in Comparative Literature from Columbia in 2010. He is now Associate Professor in the Department of Emergency Medicine at Columbia, at the Irving Medical Center, as well as a visiting professor at the University of Southern Denmark in Odense. Professor Goyal completed his residency in emergency medicine as chief resident while finishing his PhD in English and comparative literature. I don't know about you, but I don't know achievers like that. I mean, this is really the next level. So, I'm excited for you to hear him speak as well. His research interests include health humanities, the study of the novel, and medical epistemology. His writings have appeared in the Living Handbook of Narratology, and now my German is a little rusty, Aktuell Forskning, Literatur, Kultur und Medien, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, among other places. He's the co-founding editor of the online journal Synapses, a health humanities journal, the co-founding editor of the co-founding director, of the Health Language Lab, and a recipient of a National Endowment for the Humanities grant. And we were talking at lunch today that our own faculty here in the lab have just submitted the same grant. You guys received it in 2014. We are keeping our fingers crossed that Sachi and her team will be funded to start a minor in health humanities at VCU. In addition, he is currently working on increasing vaccine confidence through a grant from Columbia World Projects, which seeks to increase public confidence in the COVID-19 vaccine. By harnessing the power of data science and artificial intelligence, it develops evidence-based public messaging that encourages vaccination. Most recently, Dr. Goyal co-edited the volume Culture and Medicine, Critical Readings in Health and Medical Humanities. And I'm hoping you can talk to us about the difference between health and medical humanities, because when we started the lab, we had all sorts of conversations about this terminology. And this book was published in November last year by Bloomsbury Press. And the volume charts shared advances across the emerging fields of medical humanities and health humanities, engaging with the question of how biomedical humanities, biomedical knowledge is constructed, negotiated, and circulated as cultural practice. The title of his talk today is Medicine, Literature, and a Desire Called Utopia. Welcome to VCU, Professor Goyal.
Okay, I'm sure you can hear me okay. I can't see you. That's one of the interesting things about having the lights on me, but that's probably fine. If you're scowling, I won't know. Okay, let me put the stopwatch on. Okay, in terms of my first slide, do I need to do anything or will it automatically go on? I'm gonna waving to up there. Yep, well, we can go back. Perfect. Okay. So medicine, literature, and a desire called Utopia. Okay, first off, thank you so much. Thank you, Christina, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, Ronnie, for arranging everything so seamlessly. It's been quite an easy trip. I mean, I'm only coming from a few hours north, but it's kind of one of the first, I think, post-COVID trips I've taken in terms of kind of academic work. So I'm glad that it all still works and that we can kind of still do this. It's important. I did so many talks on Zoom. I'm sure you went to so many talks on Zoom. The kind of destabilizing, disembodied experience, while productive in some ways, it was hard to kind of fully engage in. So I'm just glad that I can be with you here today. So thank you to VCU, thank you to the Humanities Research Center. And I think it's kind of wonderful to see that we've got a dean of the College of the Arts and Sciences and a dean from the medical school, both here to kind of participate in this talk. And that's rare. And I think that that's a testament to the work that's been done here already and that you're ongoing and doing. Because the only way you're going to move forward with this is to kind of have that real interdisciplinary collaboration across fields. And these are fields that sometimes look at each other with kind of a little misapprehension, a little confusion, sometimes suspicion. But I think, as the dean mentioned, we're all kind of here to try to kind of better the kind of human condition that we're all living through. As a physician, when I'm asked to speak about literature, sometimes I feel a little bit like Kafka's Red Peter, a bit of a curiosity, something that people are coming to see. But that's still a small price to pay for the ability to kind of be a little transgressive, right? To kind of talk in earlier terms, newer terms. I get to kind of move around. And I think that I'm really thankful for that opportunity. The title is called Medicine, Literature, and a Desire, called Utopia. But I also have like a shadow title, or the catastrophic imagination. And whenever I'm doing kind of this kind of work, I try to think about my points of contact. For me, literature, the arts, medicine, these aren't separate spaces. They kind of, they make sense together. Storytelling, lots of other ways. But as I'm trying to give talks, I try to find points of direct contact. And you can imagine, as an ER physician, catastrophe, crisis is my kind of everyday, unfortunate bread and butter. But I also think it's a kind of important aspect of literary texts, especially when we think of the novel and its kind of famed climax, but even the drama, that there is usually some kind of issue at play, something that's potentially catastrophic, something that's life-changing, something that requires a kind of climb and a fall. So I think that's kind of the space where I want to talk about those two things together. I'm going to speak a little bit extemporaneously for some odd minutes. I will show some slides, so you don't have to just stare at me. I will then read a little bit kind of prepared text about two classic novels, or at least one classic novel, both by Daniel Defoe. And then I'll kind of return it back to a more kind of contemporary discussion of health. So, it probably is a little bit longer than I was anticipating, but that's the fun of this. There's so much to say. So let me start here. Okay, since part of my life is in medicine, we have to have graphs and numbers. My literary talks usually don't have any of those, but we've got some here. This is something that maybe you've come across. I think there's been enough national conversation. I saw in the HRC that I think there's a working group on this question. So what this is a graph of is maternal mortality rates in the United States over the last 20 years. And unfortunately, the story is a little bleak. It's not the kind of story we were expecting. Across all kind of races, we've had an increase in maternal mortality over this 20-year period. And maternal mortality is 1 year kind of peripartum, postpartum. And this is despite incredible advances, right, in hemorrhage control, in puerperal sepsis, infection, eclampsia, preeclampsia, all the things that traditionally killed women during childbirth, we kind of basically have an ability to deal with and manage. And yet, despite that, we're having this rise. And of course, you can immediately see part of the story is that the rise is way more disproportionately higher in Black and Indigenous people in this country, 3 to 1 times. So while there's a number of different ways of thinking about this, for the first time ever, ACOG, which is the kind of OBGYN society, and the WHO have pointed directly to racism, not just structural disparities, access questions, but directly to racism as one of the kind of potential causes. Another kind of unfortunate slide. So this is the rising morbidity and mortality in midlife in America. That's also seen kind of an increase in the last 15 to 20 years. This is the group that's around 25 to 44. And here, the demographic story is actually a little different. It's kind of one of the reasons I bring it up. The rise in mortality in this age group is much higher in white men, a group that seems to be kind of beset in this circumstances by increasing rising suicides, gun violence, alcoholic cirrhosis, what we might be calling deaths of despair in the group between 25 and 44. Finally, a third one. This is life expectancy. Now, there's been clearly a drop because of COVID, but the drop in life expectancy in the United States predates COVID. There was actually an article today in the New York Times that suggested maybe we're kind of coming back out of this. But if you notice our kind of comparable wealth-based countries, they maybe experienced a little blip around COVID, but not much. We have a marked difference in our life expectancies. So these three graphs kind of give us a counter story or a story of decline, declining health, which is striking in the sense because our biomedical enterprise has never been richer, it's never been stronger. We have an incredibly kind of new armamentarium of medications. We've got immunotherapy that's personalized for cancer. We have CRISPR-based therapies that are coming out for things like sickle cell, cystic fibrosis, other kind of chronic conditions that we can affect at the genetic level. Transplant science is something out of science fiction, right? So we have this incredible kind of wealth of biomedical transformation, and yet in so many directions, we seem to have this kind of decline narrative. So against what should be a pure progress narrative, right? Things are getting better, we're doing better. We're seeing, unfortunately, the kind of opposite in a moment that doesn't feel like that should be happening. There's a number of ways to approach this problem. And, in another, like the previous speaker or a future speaker might talk to you about AI, right? And ways in which we're going to kind of solve this problem that way. There are demographic, there are anthropological, there are sociological approaches. It's a huge problem. And I'm not going to kind of walk away here with solutions. But what I want to do is for us to take a look at this slightly differently, slightly from a kind of left field gaze, perhaps a kind of, just a different angle to see if we can kind of think about what's going on a little different rather than just posing problems and solutions. So my kind of desire for this has come out of my thinking and reading and kind of teaching about kind of utopia. It's hard to take Oscar Wilde always literally or straight, but I think it's a useful quote. A map of the world that does not include utopia is not worth even glancing at, for it leaves out the one country at which humanity is always landing. And when humanity lands there, it looks out and seeing a better country sets sail. Progress is the realization of utopias. So from the Wilde quote, you get the sense that utopia is not a place, right? He's putting it on the map, and that's kind of part of the fiction of utopia always. We have a not real place that's on a map that's not a real map. But Wilde is suggesting that utopia is kind of this journey, this progress, we get somewhere, and as soon as we get there, we realize we don't want to be there anymore, or it's a stepping stone to something else. So he's kind of telling us to think about utopia not as a final destination, not as something that we could all agree upon, but as something that's kind of on the horizon, ever always on the horizon, something to kind of strive for, something to move for. The tradition of utopia basically starts in 1516, right? This is the frontispiece to Thomas More's kind of work, Utopia. It's a work of fiction. Utopia generally as a genre is kind of unique, and I think it's the one that I want to think a little bit about with you, is because it merges or marries a kind of imaginative fictional thinking with a political or governmental thinking. So all utopias kind of hearken to an idealized or perfected society. They kind of imagine one. In More's Utopia, it's two parts. The first part is a kind of conversation, sort of more of a dialogue form between a traveler, Hythloday, and various kinds of sort of Dutch thinkers. And they're sort of discussing London at the moment, kind of what's wrong with it, what we might change. The second part is a fully worked out blueprint for a perfected society. And that's sort of what makes the kind of utopic genre different than other kinds of works. It really does suggest that there's a structural solution to, humanity's foibles, to our problems, that we're not going to perfect a human, but we might be able to kind of re-envisage the way we relate to each other. So it marries the kind of governmental question or political question with an imaginative and fictional question. The genre is kind of incredible because you start in this one moment and it spawned thousands of works. We can probably all point to one, right? But the next major one you might think of as The Tempest. which sort of kind of harkens to an island nation, to a place where there might be something that's perfect. America was sort of envisaged as this kind of utopic civilization. The term Brave New World comes from one of Miranda's speeches, which Huxley later takes on again in the same tradition. In the 17th century, you get Francis Bacon, who is our kind of major sort of Enlightenment scientific thinker, who's beginning to say the experimental method, causality, these kind of forms of thinking should predominate. He wrote a Utopia, his only fictional work, called The New Atlantis. And you get the genre starting to see its relationship to science, which builds certainly in the 19th century and 20th century, where you get Huxley writing, you get H.G. Wells writing a modern utopia. At other times, the utopia genre stands in for social problems. So Charlotte Gilman Perkins writes Herland. We get ecotopias, or kind of a utopia in the setting of kind of ecological disaster. And then in the 18th and 19th century, you get a lot of kind of restructuring of how we live. So you get communes that come all the way into the 1960s in America. Marx and Engels kind of decried utopia as sort of a pipe dream, but they were nothing if not utopic thinkers as well, in terms of their desire to kind of revolutionarily destroy everything and start again. So the utopia genre from 1516 has this very long, rich tradition. But in the 20th century, especially the second half, there's this sense that there's a drop-off, that utopias are exhausted, that we don't have either the ability or desire to kind of create an ideal or to create a perfect place. And instead, we see the rise of dystopias, right? So much of our late 20th century work that is utopic kind of actually comes out in the form of dystopias. These kind of things in which everything is wrong, usually kind of state bureaucracies, kind of, man's inhumanity to man, kind of destruction, and all of that. But I would want to kind of argue that both dystopia and utopia are in a kind of necessary dialectical relationship. You can't have one without the other. And in fact, there is a kind of productive circularity in their relationship. So this is a quote by the Marxist scholar Frederic Jameson. He's reviewing a book by Margaret Atwood, who you probably all know from The Handmaid's Tale, who, again, is a writer of dystopias, of kind of dystopias around what happens when state control is kind of taken over women's bodies. But Jameson suggests something I think is very interesting and might be useful for us, which is that the post-catastrophe situation, in reality, constitutes the preparation for the emergence of utopia itself. That you need that kind of post-catastrophe situation for that kind of thing to happen. And this was sort of central to my thinking as we were going through COVID. During my clinical shifts, I was in the ER in that kind of heady 2020, March, April, May, with just, really it did feel like the world was coming to an end. I'm sure it felt like that for here, but all of our patients were dying, right? 80% of people that came into the ER in that 5 weeks kind of ended up on a respirator or passed away. And it was a catastrophe, and it was a crisis in so many ways. But at the same time as doing that, I was teaching on Zoom and teaching a class, kind of pivoted to a class on utopias, because it felt like we needed the ability to kind of think about how we would reconstruct or kind of rebuild a society post this moment, right? And so what I want to do for the next kind of larger section is perhaps kind of read a little bit from a kind of work I'm working on about kind of Defoe's writing in particular. So, Daniel Defoe is an 18th century writer, credited with probably inventing the novel or the English novel as we know it. And one of his novels is the kind of quintessential catastrophe novel that sits uneasily in the utopia tradition, but it's always brought up. So it's Robinson Crusoe. Not going to ask how many people have read it or how many people have heard it. I find it like maybe a lot of people have heard about it and no one's read it anymore, so we won't do any of that. But it's a kind of staggering work of kind of, like bringing into consciousness the kind of inner thinking of a sort of lonely man. But alongside that novel, 3 years later, Defoe writes another novel called Journal of the Plague Year. And I want to put both of those two novels kind of in a conversation together to think about how Defoe thought about catastrophe and crisis at this early moment in the kind of 18th century. And then we'll kind of bring it back to some questions and sort of contemporary leanings. So let's move this forward. Okay, that's kind of Defoe looked like, sort of frontispiece for the novel there. I mean, sorry, what Crusoe looked like. Defoe's two novels, Robinson Crusoe and A Journal of the Plague Year, present alternative responses to catastrophe. Crusoe presents a fantastic vision of Homo economicus, who through individual self-will and self-sufficiency is able to overcome all obstacles. A Journal of the Plague Year offers a more variegated, contextual, and historically sensitive account of catastrophe on the societal level, but one that is mediated through a rich fictional consciousness. Through fictional narratives, both novels present differing visions of how societies and individuals might respond to catastrophe and cataclysm. Teaching both of these novels during the COVID-19 pandemic illuminated contradictions in the political responses to the epidemic, as the narrative forms and literary sensibilities presented individualistic and collective visions. In reading both of these novels together, I'm interested in the nature of the relationship between Defoe's fictional worlds and our real worlds. In its creative form, the novel, especially Defoe's brand of empirically realistic fiction centered on the perceptions and responses to experience, foregrounds what we might call the fiction of fiction, which is sustaining the fiction of reality. To put it a little less tendentiously, reality itself is another fiction, ideologically constructed after the fact. The particular value of teaching fictional texts and narrative structures as responses to the real world and historical pressures is in part to demonstrate that the real world is not a natural or predetermined one, but is socially and politically constructed. It is one of many possible worlds and is the result of human choices, values, and structures of power and difference. Between Crusoe and A Journal, we have two very different responses. Both novels offer utopic longings in the face of catastrophe, but where Crusoe presents the fantasy of the self-contained and fully complete solitary individual, A Journal of the Plague Year presents a more circumstantial, contingent, and contextual reordering of society on communal and collectivist principles. I'm going to discuss both of the novels in turn. So Crusoe's plot may be familiar to most readers. Man is shipwrecked on an island. He not only survives, he thrives, right? That's it. That's the novel in a nutshell. But I want to point out a few details from kind of early on in the story. Crusoe is the third son of a German immigrant. Despite his father's admonitions to stay home, pursue the middle station in life, he risks all and puts out to sea. His first voyage, disaster, ends in a swoon and a shipwreck. His subsequent voyages are no better. On the very next voyage, he gets taken prisoner and is enslaved for 2 years. He escapes with the help of a local boy, Zuri. He's off the coast, the Guinea coast, who he then quickly sells to establish himself in Brazil. He then becomes a plantation owner in Brazil. It's at this point that Crusoe now makes the journey that we all know about. So all of that is kind of his prehistory. He's built a kind of successful plantation in Brazil with sugarcane. He sets out, but now he's setting out as a slaver, intent on bringing back human capital to work on the plantations in Brazil. That's kind of what he's starting with. His early trips and disasters foreshadow all of his later problems. On the trip where he's coming to find himself some more slaves to go work on the plantation, his ship and its crew are racked by storm upon storm. They abandon the vessel and escape in a lifeboat. This too is destroyed. Gasping for breath, taking in water, Robinson endures 20 and 30-foot waves to find himself as the sole survivor of this shipwreck. Resting on the sandy shores, the island he will inhabit mostly alone for 8 and 20 years. Throughout the first part and the opening days of the island, Crusoe's narration of his inner dialogue separates the story from a mere adventure tale. His self-reflection, his recriminations, and moralizing suggest an intelligence bedeviled with self-doubt, but still eager to be the agent of his own fortunes and miseries. Battered as he is by circumstance and storm, he still actively perceives himself as a prime mover. Determining that he is unlikely to escape the island or to be rescued, he settles in. But to do so in the face of absolute calamity is not an easy task. He had washed ashore alone in a remote corner of the globe, practically naked, with no possessions. This is the crux, that he not only survives, but thrives, spotlights for me the myth of self-sufficiency, which buttresses the rational, Western, liberal, Enlightenment subject. The island provides Crusoe with the freedom to demonstrate the autonomy of the individual, to Ian Watt's phrase, as he is free to imagine his own new social and political order. He is, as Edward Said said, the founder of a new world. Crusoe establishes dominion over the entire island as he says, quote, "I am king and lord of all this country indefeasibly and had a right of possession." While he inherits his right to free trade and passage on the seas from Proteus, he takes ownership of property as his right from Locke. Where Crusoe seems either an indifferent or perhaps just an unlucky sailor, his management and improvement of life on the island is truly astounding, if not downright fantastic. Just to list some of his professions. He's a mariner, a renegade, and a castaway, but he's also a tailor, carpenter, shipbuilder, baker, farmer, goat herder, trapper, milliner, and bread maker. He builds 2 separate homes, plants and rotates crops, weaves a series of baskets, makes a kiln, oven, and mill, domesticates a herd of goats, stitches himself a goatskin hat, or at least goatskin clothes, bakes bread, and my favorite, makes goat cheese on the island. Crusoe is the very picture of ingenuity, resourcefulness, and labor. While he asserts that he is king and lord of the country, he establishes this right through enclosure, labor, and improvement. The question of enclosure was an important one for the original Utopia. When they're discussing kind of some of the ills and problems of London, the speakers in the first part point to the enclosing of the commons, right, where people had space and land to kind of plant in common. It wasn't an ownership situation, but that was enclosed for sheep, for other kinds of pasture work, and all the people were displaced. And you created an entire population of homeless or vagrant humans who no longer had an attachment to land. And then we get kind of other things that follow from that. Bless you. Despite being alone on the island, he spends much of his time building fences and enclosures. Even though the island is uninhabited, he supports his claim to ownership by removing fields and lands and gardens from the commons and working on them. As Locke would have us believe, Crusoe establishes his property rights by removing the land from the natural common state through enclosure and then mixing it with labor. The natural land of the island becomes private property through this mysterious alchemical process. But private property is not just a right established through labor and enclosure. It's a kind of miracle of augmentation. And this is from John Locke's 1695, Second Treatise on Government, incredibly influential. For he who appropriates land to himself by his labor does not lessen, but increase the common stock of mankind. For the provisions serving to the support of human life, produced by 1 acre of enclosed and cultivated land, are 10 times more than those which are yielded by an acre of land of an equal richness lying waste in common. For Locke and Crusoe, this becomes a principle for colonialist appropriation and accumulation. A man may claim as much land as he can improve, and he can claim the land of indigenous natives if they are not improving it. Crusoe derives his sense, both quotes are there. Crusoe derives his sense of ownership and mastery of the island from rational scientific cultivation and the augmentation of yield. For Crusoe, both the value of the land and his dominion over it are dependent on improvement. The natural world has no value on its own, but it's only valuable if improved by scientific management and a Baconian mastery. Again, Locke offers an important justification for whatever bread is worth more than acorns, wine than water, and clothes for silk than leaves, skin, or moss. That is wholly owing to labor and industry. Which brings me to bread making. Crusoe tells us that he worked for his bread. He made a spade and shovel to sow and plow, a kiln to make earthenware pots, a mortar and pestle to beat the grain, a sieve to separate the chaff, and an oven to bake the bread. He mowed, reaped, cured, thrashed, separated, ground, and baked his meal and made the instruments to suit these tasks. But what seems like fantastic ingenuity really rested on an error, luck, and like much else, items salvaged from the shipwreck. Early after landing on the island, Crusoe finds that his old ship has somehow also come ashore. He makes 13 dangerous trips to the wrecked vessel and recovers, among other things, ammunition, arms, clothes, shoes, a carpenter's chest, nails, hatchets, saws, an axe, a hammer, scissors, a shovel and tongs, kettles, rigging, rope, pins, thread, and needles. His bread making only begins when he inadvertently comes across stalks of barley and rice growing on the island. He sees this as a miracle and a sign of God's divine grace. But ever the rationalist, he acknowledges that they were byproducts from a rucksack he had recovered from the shipwreck, which he had inadvertently emptied in the right place in the right time. The seeds from the ship, mixed with the rain, soil, and sun of the natural world, actually provided the entire bounty. I want to make one brief but final point regarding society as I conclude this section on Crusoe. You know, he's on the island for 28 years, and he spends much of that time regretting his lack of companions. He's sort of talking, he's like, oh, if only I had someone to converse with and to be with, this time, would be spent so much better. But about midway through the novel, he's thunderstruck. He sees a footprint in the sand. Rather, though, than embracing this sign as an act of salvation, he is terrified. The mere idea or possibility of another human, as represented by the print, strikes him with abject fear and terror. The entire timbre and tone of the novel changes. We have truly entered a new world. Dread and paranoia predominate. Kind of feels like a sort of Tarantino revenge fantasy, as Crusoe makes fortifications, traps, and automatic firing weapons. He dreams of cannibals and violence and imagines that the only way to keep safe is to kill anyone and everyone that comes to the island. It will be another decade, though, before he even sees another human, and 2 more years before he engages them. It's around this moment, with the naming and enslavement of Friday. So Friday is a local native from one of the other islands who he saves and then kind of takes in and enslaves after saving. This is when we see that his kind of fantasies of independence and self-reliance are jettisoned. Crusoe names Friday for the day he saves him and teaches Friday to call him master. He makes him useful and converts him to Christianity, teaches him to cook, bake, cultivate the land, and perform all of the labors that increase the value of his property and that seem to define his freedom. With Friday performing all of the work and creating all of the value, Crusoe can actually finally be lord of his island. So Robinson Crusoe projects the perfect picture of a rugged individualist who masters his surroundings through industry and diligence. But he is also the inheritor of all the spoils of the Western world and amasses wealth and capital through an instrumental plantation economy and settler colonialism. The mythical Crusoe seems completely self-made, and his successes are meant to be seen as a product of his ingenuity and hard work. But the truth of these successes stems from the natural abundance of the island and the many objects he recovers from the shipwreck, which are the result of other people's labor. His liberalism is the myth of economic, social, and political independence. The persistence of this myth and the fantasy of individual autonomy impede our ability to engage with existential crises like pandemics and the climate emergency, which require interdependence, cooperative coalitions, and sympathetic care and aid for those most affected. So if we think of Caruso as the prototypical imaginary kind of European male who's an organ of power and self-determination, the narrator protagonist of Defoe's next novel, I don't know if there's probably one in between, but it's 1722 novel, The Journal of the Plague here, is a quieter, more diffuse consciousness. The narrator doesn't even get a name, actually. He has initials, HF. A Journal of the Plague year was written in 1722, but it's a fictionalized account of the Great Plague in London in 1665 that perhaps wiped out at least, if not more than a quarter of the population. So a kind of bigger calamity than we've just experienced potentially. The text, though, was written as a kind of premonitory, fictive political response to an outbreak of bubonic plague in Marseille in 1720, and like Caruso, purports to be a real and true account. HF, despite being told to leave, remains in the city in the face of the ongoing epidemic, even when those who can are fleeing. While the structure of the novel obviously depends on his presence during the plague, because he's narrating it, it also depends on his presence from a moral perspective. By putting himself in harm's way, his narrative appears more credible in some ways, and it validates the experience of the poor that had to stay behind. He chronicles the effects of the last great plague on the city of London, its people, its laws, its institutions, and its government. I'm not going to make you read all this text. I kind of wanted you to feel the sort of punishing quality of the first page. This is the first page of Michel Foucault's panopticism chapter of Discipline and Punish, which is kind of about the birth of the carceral state and about prisons. And the whole point kind of for him is that entire state comes out of the plague city. In the widely read panopticism chapter, Foucault describes and analyzes actions taken to limit the effects of the plague on a town at the end of the 17th century. Houses are locked, everyone is ordered to stay inside, watchmen are set outside. Against the earlier model of the leper, who had illness but was rejected and exiled from the town, the plague calls for an individualization, differentiation, and visible reorganization of bodies. Everyone and everything is cataloged, maintained in its proper place. The disciplinary power that he describes is one of spatial partitioning, segmentation, and surveillance. Quote, the plague-stricken town traversed through with hierarchy, surveillance, observation, writing. The town immobilized by the functioning of an extensive power that bears in a distinct way over all individual bodies. Foucault presents the ramification of power in the 18th century city affected by the pandemic plague as the political dream of absolute order in what he calls the utopia of a perfectly governed city. So that kind of sort of perfection here already turns into its opposite, right? Utopia is kind of always governed by its kind of other twin dystopia. In A Journal of the Plague Year, the novel that I'm going to talk about, HF, the narrator, chronicles almost all of the same procedures. He actually reprints, Defoe does, orders conceived and published by the Lord Mayor and Aldermen of the City of London concerning the infection of the plague night 1665. And it reads very much kind of like this. You get the shutting up of houses, sequestration of the sick, the appointment of watchmen, and systems of surveillance and order. But what I was struck by in reading Defoe, especially with Foucault, is that Foucault presents this frozen, immobile partitioning. Everything is exactly where it should be. It's in its place, the utopia of a perfectly governed society. But Defoe narrates a much more porous and fluid circulation of bodies and ideas. Of all the orders, HF most strikingly condemns the shutting up of houses. The shutting up of houses by force and restraining, or rather imprisoning people in their own houses, as is said above, was of little or no service in the whole. Nay, I am of the opinion it was rather hurtful. He also reports that many people simply circumvented the orders and the watchmen altogether. This section of the book is actually quite funny. While Foucault suggested that the political dream was complete, HF instead chronicles the countless ways in which citizens got around the orders. It would fill a little volume to set down the arts used by the people of such houses, to shut the eyes of the watchmen who were employed to deceive them and to escape and break out from them, in which frequent scuffles and some mischief happened. So people jumped out windows, they forged extra keys, they dug holes through their neighbors' houses, they bribed or attacked watchmen, disguised themselves, and counterfeited measure to make the houses seem locked up when they weren't. What I would suggest that these were acts of radical disobedience that HF describes with sympathy, and they're compounded by failures of the administration and the simple arithmetic of too few watchmen given the extent of the plague. In addition to these orders, Defoe presents weekly bills of mortality throughout the text. In a counterpoint to the official documents, Defoe's narrator wanders the city witnessing stories of survival and affliction. He describes mostly sympathetic portraits of individual fictional lives under the pressure of the plague. He talks to a waterman living by the seawall who supplies families living on the river with food and necessities. He relays the oracular predictions of doom of eccentric characters like Solomon Eagle, an itinerant, half-naked, street-dwelling prophet who wore a pot of burning coals on his head. He witnesses parentless children and many made insane by infection and loneliness. He watches and listens as one man jumped into the dead carts after his family, while another, a piper, was accidentally placed in one after drinking too much beer. He individualizes the countless lives of the multitudes that inhabited the infected city. The novel also offers many striking similarities to our own pandemic response. Every illness of the time was assumed to be the plague, which was a lot like COVID. The rich left the city, London or New York, or pick your city, while the poor were overrepresented in the death tolls. There was profiteering based on false treatments and widespread misinformation. The poor, because of their working conditions, often spread the disease. The essential workers kept working despite facing the most dangers. People avoided each other. The number of dead was undercounted, and at the height of the plague and also our pandemic, there were too many bodies to bury. Governments in both cases were woefully and criminally unprepared. These are only some of the instructive parallels. The form of the novel, it's kind of weird. It's heterogeneous, it's episodic. It's stringing together characters, vignettes, official documents, and tables. Wouldn't even necessarily read like a novel for us, except for HF's narrative consciousness ties the whole thing together. But one of the largest or longest episodes in the story is one I want to just relate, because it's a story of two brothers and a friend. He mentions the story early in the book, but only narrates it completely later. He says, "I come back to my three men." It's kind of in the middle, almost exactly. Their story has a moral in every part of it, and their whole conduct, and that of some who joined with, is a pattern for all poor men to follow, or women either, if ever such a time comes again. The import is clear. This is a story with a lesson on how to manage during pandemic times. The three men are a sailmaker, a carpenter, and a baker who leave London to avoid infection, but also because they can't find work. As they wander the countryside, they're denied access to various towns and certain roads under the fear that they are carriers of the plague. They join with a small company of other travelers they meet along the way and build an alternate community that supports and sustains them for a limited time. They practice their individual skills and pool resources and numbers to create temporary stability. Everybody kind of has the thing that they're good at, and it sort of provides for the entire community. It's not a perfect community, and it is only provisional, but they live in a kind of harmony with each other, with people in the neighboring towns, and with the natural world. Their lives are modest and hard, but they avoid illness and they have enough to eat and are able to build themselves shelter for protection. This makeshift outdoor community depends on the charity and compassion of villagers in local towns. The narrator's lesson in the parable seems to be the importance of charity, compassion, and collectivity in the face of calamity. And this we can see is the opposite lesson learned by Caruso, who provides autonomy and individuality. Many of the sociopolitical failures of the COVID response can be attributed to the persistent myths of individual autonomy and self-sufficiency that drive our thinking. Rather than developing compassionate, coordinated international surveillance and testing programs, individual nations closed their borders and hoarded precious treatments. American hospitals competed with each other for scarce resources like ventilators and N95 masks. The collective responsibility needed to care for each other was too often superseded by the selfish individualism of anti-maskers initially and anti-vaxxers later. The rich fled to their own island oases, and the burden of disease fell disproportionately on frontline and essential workers who are often the marginalized poor and disproportionately people of color. The classroom is where we get to explore the ideas and ideals that define our sense of citizenship and responsibility. A close and comparative study of Caruso and Journal of the Plague Year presents us with two differing competing visions of how we might want to approach catastrophe. These are among the first novels written in the English language, as Defoe somewhat unwittingly created the genre. Many of the trends or preoccupations that have established our current world order really emerged during this period. We get the transatlantic slave trade, we get scientific instrumentalism, we get industrial capitalism, we get economic liberalism. Caruso embodies many of those trends, and while the novel is famous for its circumstantial realism, the plot, to me, is anything but realistic. The fantasy of Caruso's survival and success on the island, dependent as it is on the slave trade, an instrumental approach to nature and other humans, a ship full of 18th century material goods, and an imagined sense of complete autonomy, supported the kind of individualistic thinking that led to some of the failures of the pandemic response and really our healthcare system more generally. But published less than 3 years later, a Journal of the Plague Year promotes a socio-political vision of catastrophe in which collective welfare is possible and presents a sensitive sympathy to suffering, especially the suffering of the marginalized poor. I want to return in concluding to kind of my opening along utopianism. I suggested that the kind of utopia or utopic thinking was a kind of dead end perhaps now, or was on the decline. But I will say that in the last decade or so, I feel like there's actually a kind of a resurgence, or there is a rise in that desire to kind of reimagine the world with concrete political and economic questions and choices. And I see it most strongly in the various forms of activism that we've been seeing in the last half decade, from Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter. To me, so much of this, the green economy, these are forms of utopic thinking, which may or may not work or may not make sense, but they are an attempt to think beyond the sort of small, limited frameworks that we've inherited from our kind of like historical past. Now, the problem that we're facing, I think, is what might be called the US health disadvantage. This kind of harkens back to the sort of my first three graphs. And this is what kind of strikes me most strongly, especially as somebody that works in the ER and takes care of people in a sort of safety net system. Compared with people in other OECD countries, so comparable wealth, mostly European, Americans have higher child poverty, eat more calories, lack universal access to healthcare, experience more racial segregation, have more access to guns, are beset with greater loneliness, are in the throes of an opioid crisis, face poorer food options, possess worse oral health, face an epidemic of suicide and alcohol-related deaths, and are enduring spiraling mental health. So this is just some of the reasons why we've got this kind of gap between our sort of comparable nations. So kind of to conclude, I want to kind of use this phrase, social dreaming. It's Ruth Levitas, who's a utopic thinker. You know, everyone wants to define what utopia means. It's sort of easier to define it as a kind of process or as an approach than I think as an imaginary place. So social dreaming is what she suggests the value of utopic thinking is. In the kind of two novels I discussed, we kind of came across what I'd like to point out as a kind of series of sort of problematic kind of societal myths and moments. Isolation. We see, you know, Caruso isolated on this island for 28 years. One of the striking things that contemporary readers and readers today notice is that, you know, the psychological damage to being on that island by himself, Defoe never talks about. And yet every actual account of a shipwreck shows a kind of a destroyed person, a person who by themselves kind of loses their touch with their own humanity. So isolation in itself is a kind of illness. Domination, we see that in the kind of Baconian mastery. We see that in the forms of kind of augmentation and yield generation that have probably led to a significant space in our kind of climate crisis. We've kind of taken the sort of Earth's bounty for granted and just sort of pushed. So we've sort of dominated both other people and places in nature. Uneven geographies is, you know, more so, there's like a kind of famous saying, which is something like, your zip code is a better predictor of your health outcomes than your genetic code. And a lot of that is because the places that we live in are healthy or not healthy. They are, for a number of reasons. And what you saw in New York City, at least, was that the parts of New York City during the pandemic that were most heavily poor, most heavily Black and brown, had by far the highest mortality rates. And the areas that were kind of richer, more white, had next to nothing. So the comparison point is stark and it's frustrating. And it was also the case in kind of London in Defoe's time. Inequality and equity. Toxicities come up in the texts throughout, but in particular in Defoe's London, the kind of burial of the bodies was only in kind of places that poor people were living. What we put in places, how we ruin the groundwater, you're already starting to see that there. And just the very notion of the private, right, of enclosing, of taking out of the commons a space that we could all share, right? That kind of notion of private property is theft, right? That's Proudhon. Is kind of crucial to most utopic dreaming, to kind of think about private property in a sort of complicated way. So if we offer just some suggestions, and again, nothing here is literal, but you know, the kind of counterpoint obviously to isolation is community. And for me, it's not just community that sort of goes along our kind of well-trodden kind of tribal forms, but some new forms of community that need to be developed. And we see that kind of coming out of, I think, the various kinds of activist movements, that maybe we can sort of combine these and form different ways of relating to each other that aren't kind of the sort of typical socio-demographic groups that we've been accustomed to. You know, against domination, we can obviously throw in cooperation. We see that in the parable that Defoe offers in A Journal of the Plague Year, where the three kind of men go out into the community and form a kind of alternate community. It's also, if you haven't, I recommend highly Rebecca Solnit's book, Paradise Built in Hell, which is a kind of lovely account of the ways in which out of catastrophic situations, earthquakes, fires, cataclysms of all kind, groups of people have managed to form communities that have kind of stood up against that sort of cataclysm and calamity. You know, we need to kind of think, this is where the sort of the policy question becomes really critical as we think about the ways in which utopia is a kind of governmental or political response. That zoning is incredibly critical to how we rethink our uneven geographies. We need to have, parks, schools, green spaces everywhere, not just in areas of kind of wealth and prestige and affluence. Without a doubt, the kind of movements that we saw alongside the kind of COVID moment especially, there was a huge uproar and excitement around both racial and reproductive justice movements that are responding to the tremendous inequality and inequity that we saw in these mortality rates. Another kind of political policy question is, what are we going to do with infrastructure? From our kind of clean air, land, and water, we used to sort of be a country that was kind of prided on these kinds of qualities. So we sort of need to get back to some of that. And in response to the private, I just kind of offer the public as something that we have to reinvest in. We have to ask ourselves what a public is, what the public sphere is, what kind of public do we want? And we're going to have to really actively create a space in which we can have conversations across different kind of political and ideological spaces in a true kind of acceptable public sphere. And I'm going to end with just one quote. This one I will read, even though it's long. George Eliot is kind of, I think, one of the wisest 19th century writers, even though that kind of wisdom is sometimes not something it's sort of fallen out of favor. The greatest benefit we owe to the artist, whether painter, poet, or novelist, is the extension of our sympathies. Appeals founded on generalizations and statistics require a sympathy ready-made, a moral sentiment already in activity. But a picture of human life, such as a great artist can give, surprises even the trivial and the selfish into that attention to what is apart from themselves, which may be called the raw material of moral sentiment. Art is the nearest thing to life. It is a mode of amplifying experience and extending our contact with our fellow men beyond the bounds of our personal law. Thank you very much for your attention. Don't know, are we doing any Q&A or moving to, because that was a kind of a long talk, you probably all want something to eat and drink. Would you like to take some questions? Sure, I'm happy to, either way.
2 or 3 questions here.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. So I had a quick question for you about kind of modern, in our day and age, utopic thinking. So in terms of thinking of the utopia, you talked a lot about like political activism as kind of being the avenue for inspiring that level of thinking. But I was wondering what your thoughts were on social media and the social media aspect of how that's able to spread these types of forms of thinking, but also can tend to hinder communities because of all of the negativity and hate that's being spread on it. So what are your thoughts on how we can use social media as a way to hopefully create a utopia?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we saw that a lot in the kind of Arab Spring, right? Where there was this moment where it felt like these new technologies were going to allow new forms of activism. And they did for a moment, but I think very quickly they sort of get co-opted. I don't have a solution to any of that. I mean, I think the part of the difficulty I always found was the ways in which these sort of idealized representations, especially the kind of photographic questions, become a pressured norm rather than something to search for. In teaching, students talked a lot about cottagecore. Do you guys know what that is? So yeah, like I didn't know anything about that. And they were like, this is what's on the internet. This is the kind of, it's a utopic formation, obviously, right? It's kind of pre-industrial. It's meant to take out the kind of science out and kind of form a community. But it was sort of absurd. And it was kind of founded around impossible principles of kind of privilege. Baking bread becomes a very important part in all that, because like, who could do that? That's what everybody was doing supposedly but nobody was eating it during COVID. So I always found that striking. So I don't know, it's like a long-winded answer to say, I'm not sure how social media becomes a space for us to kind of engage other than as a way to set up kind of meeting points when you can't otherwise.
Thanks for a great talk. Really, really interesting. I have like 10 questions I want to ask you, but the first biggest question that I thought maybe would interest more people is like, and I don't know how much you know about Defoe's life or times or whatever, but like, I'm shocked that those two texts could be written by the same person. They seem to be politically diametrically opposed to one another. So what's going on with that? Like, is the you said like, okay, he's responding to catastrophe. Is the catastrophe of the plague like what changed his politics, or is he just a man of diverse I don't know, like currents of political thought or something? Or I mean, that was just what I was left scratching my head a bit of, like, how does one person produce two texts that seem in such clashing with one another? Clashing, I don't know what I'm saying. You get the idea, right?
No, fantastic question. And I think part of what intrigues me about Defoe is the kind of life biography too, right? The guy was bankrupt twice. Once on he tried to fund an underwater dirigible that was going to, like a submarine, that was going to get gold from the bottom of the ocean, lost fortune that way. And another one was he had these cats, like big cats, like jaguars and stuff, and they were going to civet cats, and he was going to kind of extract their perfume. So he had to bring over and so he lost all his money that way too. He's a political chameleon. I mean, there's clearly a moment that he's out of, which is kind of the English Empire. He believes in kind of trade, and he's a dissenter, right? So he's not part of the kind of mainstream. He's not with Addison and Steele in this moment. He's kind of the people himself. He's been in stocks. He maybe started the first spy ring in England too. He wrote thousands and thousands of pamphlets. Like, his big thing was pamphleteering. And he would often write on both sides of any issue, whether it's sort of, Tory or Whig. And he was adept at moving between those things. So, what's the real Defoe? I don't know. But it's striking that one is a kind of personal story of catastrophe, and the other is kind of a societal story. And I think in all his writing, he has a tremendous amount of sympathy for kind of others, for the kind of the people, right? So he's like the first English novelist to name characters by a first name and a last name. He's sort of bringing in the kind of every man, every woman into these stories. And these aren't the typical stories that we're told, right? Like Roxanne and Mole Flanders are a kind of different strike. And this is all at the end of his life. The novelist Defoe is near his last stage. And Robinson Crusoe is like a hit. I mean, he wrote sequels and he was just trying to, constantly make money off of it.
Thanks so much for this talk. I really am fascinated by the ways that you sort of identify these two different responses to crisis, the sort of individualism and the social porosity, communitarianism in Daniel Defoe. And I am on board with the idea of social porosity as like a better response to crisis. I think what I'm genuinely wondering about is the idea of choice, which seems to be such an individual concept, an individualized concept, and so much emphasized in healthcare these days, sometimes problematically, as the reproductive justice movement has called attention to. And so I guess I'm just wondering if there is a place for choice. How would we think about choice differently, potentially, in this utopia or in social dreaming? And can literature sort of help us with that in some way?
That's a great question. From probably my kind of take on Caruso, I do have a little bit of a problem with kind of too strong an assertion of individual choice against the needs of some other larger entity, right? We call that community, call that nation, call that state. I think we do have to figure out how we can play those two things together. Like there is a limit, to, as we know in all the kind of rights philosophers, that there is a limit to personal choice in terms of how it infringes upon other people's choices. There's no freedom without some form of limitation or kind of negative freedom. Community, in a way, I didn't say enough, because I think a lot of our kind of, even our research agenda needs to kind of move forward in community-based form. So the mainstream medical community is recognizing that community healthcare workers and community-based research initiatives are really important, where the questions aren't coming directly from a kind of somebody in charge of a study, but in fact from a kind of community. Defining that community and the community's ideals and values seems like a necessary start to say that we have to have some kind of shared notion of what it means to be kind of living on this planet or in this space together. And the commitment has to be to each other to say, how are we going to best kind of augment that without and that may cause limiting choices. Like, I think that the question around vaccines it's a fascinating one, because I spent a lot of time reading. It's a large project on reading millions of texts. I didn't read them all, the computer did, but online, right? Like on Reddit and all these forums about kind of anti-vax rhetoric. And it often is couched in terms of freedom, but just feels so selfish. And so, I think that's kind of where I would come away with that.
Thank you so much for, just such a rich discussion. I'm wondering, since the start of the pandemic, as a healthcare worker, as a professor, like from your positionality, has your relationship to any aspects of the communal thinking and living changed or been enhanced in any way? Thanks.
Yeah, on a personal level, it deeply has. I live in Harlem on a block where people have lived. It's a traditionally African-American part of the city that was kind of, a sort of cultural center in the 20s, and was part of a kind of migration of people from the South into New York City. And many people on my block have been there for families for generations. And what was, in the beginning of COVID, everybody was scared, right? And we were all separated, and everybody knows each other on this block. And I would get my neighbor who gave me my dog, so I love my neighbor. But my neighbor, stepped back when I was coming home from work. He's like, oh, I don't want to get that, right? I don't know what you're bringing back from the hospital. And it was clear, fear. And I understood it. We were scared at home. We didn't really know what was going on. But that morphed quickly, actually, after those first 4 or 5 weeks, into a much more kind of communal living situation on the street, where people started to realize that being outdoors was good. So there were so many more cookouts. There was a lot more interest. And fortunately, this was also part of it. I went to a couple of funerals in the neighborhood of people that died of and during COVID. And that was a kind of communal ritual, right? How we deal with death, but doing it together certainly kind of brought me closer to the community I was living in. But the opposite in the ER, it has been that the kind of bottom seems to have fallen out in a lot of urban spaces, where the people that are coming to the emergency room are even more broken than they were before. There's so much more kind of mental illness. It feels like there's a lot more kind of overdoses of all kinds, and the numbers will back me up on this. But it's palpable when you go to work, and it's quite a big burden actually on healthcare workers. So I think that it's something that we're going to have to reckon with, to think about how do we sustain and kind of nourish the healthcare workers that went through this. Many of the nurses that I work with and I depend on clinically left during COVID and kind of took different jobs. They're just I'm not doing this anymore. And they've been replaced by well-meaning, but people that have had no experience. And that's a huge problem and a disaster. So trying to kind of reinvigorate, revitalize the kind of practice of medicine as a kind of older form of caring seems important too. But we have to care for the caregivers.
Thank you so much. And please join us for a reception here. Please help me thank Professor Goyal for a really rich and enlightening talk.